If you recall our discussion from earlier, the respiratory zone consists of several major components. Remember, the respiratory zone is the area within the respiratory system capable of accomplishing gas exchange. This will include the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and also the individual alveoli. So we're going to take a look at an image here that kind of shows you many of these. Remember, the terminal bronchioles were the end of the conducting zone. So those terminal bronchioles are going to branch and give rise to respiratory bronchioles. Respiratory bronchioles usually have short outpouchings on them that resemble primitive alveoli. This is why they are capable of carrying out gas exchange. The respiratory bronchioles are then going to lead to alveolar ducts. Alveolar ducts are tubes that lead to collections of alveoli. The collections of alveoli are called alveolar sacs, and obviously, being collections of alveoli, you're obviously going to see variable amounts of individual alveoli. It is the alveoli that are the main sites of gas exchange. You can see here the simple squamous epithelium that lines each individual alveolus. So that's why there's such a thin nature to the walls of many of these structures that you see within this micrograph, because of the fact that we're looking at a number of different alveoli and their walls are lined by simple squamous epithelium. Now, having made mention of the fact that the walls of an alveolus are lined by simple squamous epithelium, I need to talk to you about now, or at least mention to you, the second major structural change that occurs as you proceed from larger to smaller airways. Previously, we talked about the amount of cartilage decreasing while the amount of smooth muscle increases. Well, now we need to take a look at the epithelial lining, seen here in the second column. If you start at the trachea, you can see within the trachea you have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. This is also true throughout all of the bronchi. However, once you transition into the bronchioles, the epithelial lining begins to change. It goes from being pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium to being ciliated simple columnar in the bronchioles, and then you lose the cilia when you reach the terminal bronchioles. Once you transition to the respiratory zone, you're going to see that instead of having columnar epithelium, it will be simple cuboidal. And as you proceed to smaller and smaller airways, that simple cuboidal epithelium will transition to being simple squamous epithelium. So, throughout all of your larger airways, the trachea and all the various bronchi, you have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. As you move into the bronchioles, you lose the multiple layering effect of the pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and you become ciliated simple columnar. By the time you reach the terminal bronchioles, at this point you just have simple columnar epithelium minus the cilia. As you enter the respiratory zone, the epithelial lining gets even thinner as the columnar cells become cuboidal in shape, and then ultimately, by the time you reach the main areas where gas exchange takes place, instead of even being cube-shaped, that epithelium is one layer of flat cells. The overall pattern here is that as you proceed from large to small airways, the epithelial lining gets thinner. And that thin nature of the epithelial lining is critical to gas exchange because gas exchange occurs via diffusion. If you had a very thick lining, that would take a long time for gas to move back and forth across, so the lining gets thinner as you approach the respiratory zone due to the fact that that thinner wall is going to facilitate faster gas exchange. We're going to take a look here now at the structure of an alveolus. And when you look at the alveolus here, you're going to see two different cell types within its wall. One is called a type 1 pneumocyte, or your book uses the term alveolar cell. The other is called a type 2 alveolar cell. Each one has its respective job to do. The type 1 alveolar cells are the simple squamous epithelium that makes up the wall of the alveolus. They are very thin, obviously, in nature, and this creates somewhat of a problem. If you look at many tissues, including the cells that make up the alveolus, they're not they're not dry, within the body. Instead, they're wet. They're covered with fluid. If this fluid was primarily water, what happens is the water molecules are going to be attracted to one another, something that we refer to as being surface tension. Well, the alveolus, if it was coated with just plain water, would have so much surface tension across the surface of it that ultimately the water molecules will be attracted to each other, come together, and that will cause the alveolus to collapse. This would be bad because a collapsed alveolus can't receive air because it's closed. Enter now the type 2 alveolar cells. These type 2 alveolar cells are responsible for producing a secretion called surfactant. Surfactant is primarily a mixture of proteins and lipids, and what it does, the surfactant, is reduce the surface tension. So nature, quite honestly, wants the alveoli to collapse if it was just covered with water. But by mixing in this surfactant, that reduces the surface tension, allowing the alveoli to remain open, and therefore they don't collapse. Now if you look over here in the lower right hand corner, you have the details of what we call the respiratory membrane. This is the membrane across which gas exchange takes place. You should keep in mind the components of this respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane consists of a type 1 alveolar cell, see it mentioned there, along with that type 1 alveolar cell's basement membrane, kind of the darker purple line right here. Since you're exchanging gases between air and blood, well, we also need the blood involved. Enter now the capillary. So the capillary is lined by endothelium, another squamous or flat cell, and then you also have to consider that capillary's basement membrane, that solid red line you see going right there. In all, this respiratory membrane is the thinnest barrier possible between two sections. You've got two simple squamous epithelial cells, the type 1 alveolar cell along with the endothelium, and you've got their basement membranes. That's it. So it's as thin as possible. Once again, this goes back to the fact that gas exchange occurs via diffusion. And you don't want that distance to be a great distance, because if it was too big, the distance that is, gas exchange would occur very slowly and you would not get the oxygen that your tissues require. So that respiratory membrane is thin to ultimately allow for very quick, or at least faster, gas exchange.